Inside Alcatraz, Deadliest Inmates and Grim Meals of the Rock. True crime documentary. The Rock Awakens. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because what you're about to witness on The Rock will chill you to the bone. The fog rolled in thick over San Francisco Bay, smothering Alcatraz Island in a gray, damp veil. The morning was quiet, almost eerily so, interrupted only by the distant cries of seagulls and the occasional creak of the ferry docking at the mainland. Guards made their routine rounds, keys jangling, boots echoing across the narrow concrete walkways. Within the walls, a different world stirred, one of strict schedules, hidden rivalries, and the silent negotiation of survival. Inside the dining hall, the air smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and stale bread, a reminder that for the inmates of Alcatraz, every meal was an exercise in endurance. According to archived reports from the National Archives and testimonies compiled in inmate memoirs, meals were strictly regulated, portion sizes controlled, timing rigid, and substitutions almost unheard of. The infamous meat and beans rations often became the subject of whispered complaints among prisoners. Watery soups diluted further by the island's limited fresh water supply were commonplace. Even for the notorious, men like Al Scarface Capone or George Machine Gun Kelly, the table was no sanctuary. Food could be a weapon, a reward, or a form of subtle punishment. In the cell blocks above, men stirred awake to the clang of the morning bell. Solitary confinement cells, known as the Hole, lay empty for now but carried a reputation that sent chills down even the most hardened inmate's spine. According to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons historical files, infractions as minor as a misplaced towel or a late bedroll could result in reduced rations or confinement. For those who had survived attempted escapes or rival gang tensions, the meals in the dining hall offered a rare, if grim, opportunity to measure who had influence and who remained vulnerable. One former inmate, writing under a pseudonym in a 1960s oral history collection, described the process. You learned the patterns. You watched who got what. Sometimes, a slice of bread meant more than it seemed. Even routine distribution carried tension. Guards patrolled with an eagle eye, aware that disputes over food could erupt into violence in seconds. Inmates had their hierarchies, often determined not only by past crimes but also by physical presence and mental acuity. In this enclosed ecosystem, each bowl of stew or slab of meat was a negotiation, a reflection of compliance, patience, and subtle power. According to reports in the National Archives, some men went days consuming only bread and water after infractions or as part of disciplinary measures, while others, often the most cunning, secured extras through trades or intimidation. The hallways of Alcatraz were lined with steel doors and small, barred windows that allowed slivers of light to pierce the darkness. Guards called out names, rattled keys, and maintained the rhythm of control. In this environment, rumor and observation were as crucial as strength. One unconfirmed account noted that certain inmates had memorized the guards' habits well enough to predict when a leftover meal might be slipping under the radar, a quiet survival tactic against the system's oppressive order. Lunch trays, simple though they were, became more than nourishment, they were currency. A shared portion could cement alliances, while a withheld slice could ignite resentment. The most dangerous inmates understood this unspoken code well. Even the seemingly innocuous meal carried lessons in patience, observation, and the constant balancing act between obedience and rebellion. By midday, the fog over the bay had begun to lift, exposing the jagged edges of the island cliffs. The sun glinted off the iron bars of the exercise yards, a stark reminder that every inch of Alcatraz was a battlefield of endurance. Inmate footsteps echoed along the corridors, the clatter of utensils mixing with whispered exchanges. Every meal consumed, every morsel tasted, was a negotiation of survival, a test of wit and nerve inside one of the nation's most notorious prisons. At the end of the first meal, guards collected trays with practiced efficiency. Some inmates returned to their cells silently, while others lingered, trading information and gauging alliances. In this microcosm of society, food was more than sustenance. It was a signal, a story, and sometimes the first step toward danger. According to archived reports, those who misstepped, whether through disrespect, rivalry, or mere chance, often faced solitary confinement, reduced meals, or worse. The Rock was a place where every action, even sitting down for a meal, carried consequences. And yet, beneath the strict order and chilling discipline, life persisted. Men planned, observed, and adapted to the rhythm of Alcatraz. Each tray of watery soup, each portioned slice of bread, told a story of survival, strategy, and the silent endurance required to outlast the island's harsh regime. According to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons Archives, even the deadliest inmates found ways to endure, making each meal a quiet but critical battle for their own resilience. As the day stretched forward, the fog began to retreat completely from the rocky cliffs surrounding the island. Yet inside, the tension never lifted. The Rock held secrets, rivalries, and survival tactics that few outside could ever comprehend. And as the final clatter of trays echoed through the halls, one truth became clear. In Alcatraz, survival was about more than escape. It was about enduring every meal, every look, and every moment with a calculated mind. Shadows behind bars. Before we go deeper into The Rock, hit subscribe, because surviving Alcatraz was never just about escaping, it was about outthinking everyone around you. The morning sun had begun to warm the jagged rocks surrounding Alcatraz Island, but inside, the atmosphere remained heavy and oppressive. The corridors were narrow, echoing with the shuffle of boots and the occasional clang of steel doors. Inmates, still adjusting from the previous day's rationed meals, moved with cautious purpose. Every glance could betray a secret, every gesture could signal allegiance or defiance. According to inmate testimonies collected in archived reports, navigating the social structure of Alcatraz required as much mental fortitude as physical strength. In the dining hall, the echoes of yesterday's tension lingered. Certain men, known in records only by pseudonyms, had established dominance through silent intimidation or control of minor resources. Even a slice of bread could become leverage in a calculated trade, and watching who received what portion became a subtle sport of observation. The U.S. Bureau of Prisons reports describe how some inmates, particularly those with violent histories, used mealtime to reinforce authority, creating small hierarchies that extended well beyond the hall. This unspoken order often dictated movement through the prison, interactions in the yard, and the allocation of favors or contraband. At the north cell block, whispers carried like static through the air. Reports indicate that inmates often exchanged coded information about guards' routines or about potential vulnerabilities in security measures. One unconfirmed account from a former prisoner's oral history notes that men would silently signal with hand gestures or slight nods, transmitting warnings about threats or opportunities. In these subtle communications, the deadliest inmates maintained control over aspects of life on the Rock, despite the rigid structures imposed by guard. The danger was constant. A misstep in observation or allegiance could lead to punishment or isolation. The work details also played a critical role in inmate survival. Men assigned to kitchen duty, for example, had both access and risk. The National Archives include reports of prisoners in these positions discreetly observing tray distributions, noting who received extra rations or missed items. While such actions were rarely punishable, they allowed certain inmates to gain influence, trade favors, or curry small measures of protection from others. Even mundane tasks became strategic exercises in survival, revealing a microcosm of power where patience and observation outweighed brute force. Gang affiliations, though less overt than in modern penitentiaries, shaped interactions. Men who had histories in organized crime, labor unions, or street gangs prior to incarceration carried influence, often subtle but enforceable through intimidation or persuasion. According to historical reconstructions, these networks sometimes dictated who ate first, who received minor privileges, and even which cells were safer. Inmates quickly learned that a single misstep could ignite conflicts that escalated rapidly within the iron and concrete walls of the prison. Exercise yards provided both release and risk. According to U.S. Bureau of Prisons accounts, yard time was monitored closely, yet the open space allowed for strategic alliances, confrontations, and the subtle assertion of dominance. Men who understood the rhythm of guards' patrols could exploit small gaps in surveillance, exchanging whispered warnings or testing rival reactions. Every movement was a calculation. Even a casual glance could be interpreted as a challenge. Meals, work assignments, and yard time combined into a constant chess match of survival. A man who misread intentions or underestimated the intelligence of a peer risked isolation in the SHU, reduced rations, or, according to unconfirmed inmate recollections, a sudden physical altercation. These encounters were rarely documented in official reports but were corroborated in multiple oral histories and memoirs, giving a glimpse of the psychological tension that pervaded daily life. By mid-afternoon, Alcatraz was a symphony of calculated motion. Keys rattling, guards moving in synchronized routines, and inmates maneuvering through observation, conversation, and subtle dominance. The most dangerous men, those whose past crimes included violent acts, organized schemes, or notorious escapes, held silent sway over their peers. They understood that influence inside the rock did not come from raw strength alone. It came from control over information, food, and perception, elements that were often invisible to the untrained eye. And yet, even with careful planning and strategic alliances, the island's isolation meant that miscalculations could be catastrophic. Reports indicate that minor disputes during meal distribution occasionally escalated into fistfights or threats of violence, prompting guards to intervene. Solitary confinement awaited those who faltered, a grim reminder that the prison's discipline was relentless. In this environment, every decision, whom to trust, how to react, when to speak, carried consequences as tangible as the cold steel bars enclosing them. As the day drew to a close, the fog rolled back over the bay, shrouding Alcatraz in gray once more. Shadows lengthened in the cell blocks, and the quiet hum of anticipation hung over the corridors. Survival was more than endurance. It was a continuous exercise in vigilance, subtlety, and psychological mastery. Each meal, each glance, each whispered signal could alter the fragile balance of life behind the rock. And as the clatter of trays and the echo of boots faded into evening, one chilling realization settled over the island. In Alcatraz, even a moment of inattention could change everything. Inside the shadows of the rock, before we continue, hit subscribe, because inside Alcatraz, danger isn't just outside the cell. It's hidden in every glance, every meal, and every whispered word. The fog over San Francisco Bay had thickened again, clinging to the rocky cliffs and casting the island in an almost otherworldly gray. Inside the prison, life carried on with its relentless rhythm. Guards patrolled the narrow corridors, keys jangling, eyes scanning for any deviation from protocol. Inmates moved with cautious purpose, aware that the smallest misstep could result in punishment or isolation. Historical accounts from the National Archives describe these hallways as a maze of psychological tension, where silent observation was as critical as physical strength. In the dining hall, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Meals continued to serve as both sustenance and a tool for maintaining order. According to U.S. Bureau of Prisons reports, portions were strictly regulated, and deviations were rare. However, inmate memoirs and oral histories reveal that certain men, often those with prior criminal influence, managed to secure slightly better rations or trade extra portions for information or favors. One composite account recounts how an inmate nicknamed Red quietly monitored the distribution, noting who had leverage over others. In Alcatraz, control of a meal could be a quiet assertion of dominance, and every tray became a negotiation in survival. The cell blocks were a theater of silent power. Some of the deadliest inmates, men with histories of organized crime, violent offenses, or notorious escape attempts, wielded influence through strategic intimidation. Reports indicate that even the most minor perceived slights could spark tension. Guards were aware of these dynamics but were limited in how they could intervene, often relying on routine checks and solitary confinement as deterrent. In one documented incident, an inmate reportedly attacked another over a minor dispute regarding a portion of bread. The altercation was quelled swiftly, but it highlighted how fragile the order could be. Exercise yards offered a mix of relief and peril. According to historical reconstructions, rivalries occasionally surfaced here, despite constant supervision. Inmates used subtle body language, nods, and positioning to communicate allegiance or issue warnings. These small, nearly invisible signals were crucial for survival. One pseudonymous inmate memoir described how certain men would position themselves near exits or observe guard routines to anticipate conflicts or opportunities. Even simple movement through the yard was calculated, with every step weighed against potential threat. Work details inside the prison provided both opportunity and danger. Men assigned to kitchen duties, laundry, or maintenance gained limited access to resources and movement. According to National Archives reports, these assignments allowed observant inmates to notice guard patterns, the arrival of new shipments, or changes in routines. In some cases, information gleaned in these roles was used to manipulate alliances or settle scores, all within the constraints of a highly controlled environment. Even seemingly mundane tasks became strategic exercises in influence. Alcatraz housed men with notorious criminal backgrounds, though exact identities were often disguised for privacy in historical reconstructions. One composite account combines elements from multiple reports. A man with a history of high-profile bank robberies carefully monitored younger inmates, subtly asserting authority without overt aggression. Another composite figure, drawn from interviews, maintained influence by protecting certain prisoners in exchange for minor privileges, demonstrating the subtle economy of control that defined the prison's social fabric. These interactions were rarely violent, but the psychological stakes were immense. Conflict, however, was never far from the surface. Historical records indicate that minor disputes in meals, work assignments, or yard time sometimes escalated rapidly, prompting guard intervention or temporary lockdowns. An unconfirmed report from a former inmate suggests that some men timed movements during meal distributions to assert dominance or test rival reactions. While not officially documented, multiple oral histories corroborate the idea that the smartest inmates survived by reading patterns, predicting behavior, and striking subtly when necessary. By late afternoon, the island's fog had lifted slightly, revealing the jagged cliffs and the surrounding cold waters. Inside, Alcatraz continued its rhythm: strict schedules, measured movements, and constant observation. Guards enforced discipline with precision, but they could not control the invisible hierarchies established by the inmates themselves. The deadliest men learned that patience and awareness were as vital as strength or reputation. Even a moment of distraction could result in an altercation, a lost advantage, or confinement in the SHU. As evening approached, the dining hall emptied once more. Trays were collected, and the prisoners returned to their cells under the watchful gaze of the guards. The quiet of the night belied the tension that permeated every cell, corridor, and exercise yard. In Alcatraz, survival was a combination of foresight, alliances, and subtle psychological maneuvering. According to reports and verified memoirs, the men who endured longest were those who mastered these invisible rules, understanding that power in the rock was rarely displayed openly, but always carefully negotiated. And as the steel doors clanged shut for the night, a sense of foreboding hung over the island. Inmates whispered strategies, watched each other intently, and calculated the next move. The rock had already claimed many lives, reputations, and minds. And as history would show, even the smallest miscalculation could turn survival into disaster. Tides of danger. Before we continue, hit subscribe, because inside Alcatraz, danger wasn't just lurking in the shadows, it was woven into every meal, every routine, and every glance across the cell blocks. The gray morning fog clung stubbornly to the cliffs surrounding Alcatraz, giving the island an almost spectral presence. Inside, the day began like every other, the metallic clang of cell doors, the echo of boots along concrete corridors, and the disciplined rhythm of the guards' patrols. Yet beneath this routine, the undercurrent of tension pulsed as palpably as the Pacific waves crashing against the rocks. According to National Archives reports and historical reconstructions, every morning meal was not merely sustenance but an arena where alliances, rivalries, and power hierarchies played out silently among the inmates. Life inside the cell blocks required constant vigilance. Inmates with prior convictions for violent crimes, including bank robberies and gang-related offenses, exerted subtle authority. Historical accounts note that even seemingly trivial privileges, access to reading materials, slight modifications in work details, or the timing of meals, could shift influence among prisoners. One pseudonymous account combines observations from multiple inmates. A man known for his calculated demeanor used kitchen duty and meal distribution to quietly gather information about who held sway in the cell block. These micro-power plays often dictated safety and survival, demonstrating that mental acuity could outweigh brute strength on the rock. The infamous exercise yard, though enclosed and under guard watch, was another stage where survival depended on observation and timing. U.S. Bureau of Prisons reports confirm that physical altercations occasionally erupted here, particularly when disputes over hierarchy or perceived disrespect flared. On one documented occasion, a scuffle broke out between two men over the order of lines for a recreational activity, resulting in immediate intervention by guards and temporary solitary confinement for those involved. Such events highlighted the razor-thin line between order and chaos within Alcatraz, a line that inmates learned to navigate meticulously. Mealtime continued to be a focal point for silent negotiations. Historical reports describe that food portions were strictly rationed and closely monitored, yet inmate memoirs indicate subtle exchanges occurred. A slice of bread traded for information, a slightly larger serving leveraged for favor. One unconfirmed account notes that a prisoner memorized the guard's rotation schedule to predict which cell blocks received attention first, allowing him to manipulate minor advantages without overt confrontation. These tactical decisions were emblematic of the constant chess game of survival on the rock. Documented incidents from the 1940s and 1950s underscore the ever-present threat of violence. The prison housed men like Robert Stroud, though not all inmates were simultaneously there, whose notoriety for past crimes created a tense environment for fellow prisoners. Historical records detail that even non-violent men could become targets if perceived as weak, disrespectful, or disruptive to the established social order. Oral histories corroborate this, emphasizing that vigilance, silence, and strategic alliances were critical for enduring life on the island. The daily routines were relentless. Work details, laundry, maintenance, and kitchen chores were assigned and monitored, yet these routines offered opportunities for observation and influence. Composite accounts suggest that the most cunning inmates leveraged these moments to gather information, test alliances, or assert control subtly. Guards were vigilant, but their primary tools were discipline and isolation, punishment that could be swift, severe, and psychologically taxing. According to National Archives reports, solitary confinement, often for minor infractions, was a constant reminder of the prison's strict hierarchy and the consequences of miscalculation. Alcatraz's isolation amplified psychological tension. Men spent hours in narrow cells, listening to distant footsteps, the intermittent clang of doors, and the whispered schemes of their peers. Memoirs from former prisoners emphasize that the mental strain of this environment was profound. Maintaining composure while reading subtle social cues could mean the difference between safety and confrontation. Even a casual glance could be interpreted as a challenge, and alliances could shift in minutes. By mid-afternoon, the fog outside began to lift, revealing the jagged cliffs and turbulent waters below. Inside, the environment remained taut, a combination of structure and unpredictability. Reports confirm that rare escape attempts, though ultimately unsuccessful, injected an added layer of tension into daily life. Guards and inmates alike were acutely aware that any lapse in vigilance, any underestimation of fellow prisoners, could have disastrous consequences. As evening approached, the dining hall emptied and the echoes of trays being collected faded through the corridors. Inmates returned to their cells, some silently plotting, others simply enduring. In Alcatraz, survival was a continuous test of patience, perception, and subtle manipulation. According to archival evidence and verified testimonies, those who thrived were not necessarily the strongest or most violent, but those who could read human behavior, anticipate threats, and navigate the island's unspoken rules with precision. And as the steel doors clanged shut for the night, a pervasive quiet settled over the rock. Beneath the surface, rivalries simmered, alliances solidified, and the unseen currents of power shifted silently. For the deadliest inmates, each day was a high-stakes game, a delicate balance between compliance, strategy, and survival that could unravel in an instant. The grip of the rock. Before we continue, hit subscribe, because on Alcatraz, survival wasn't about freedom, it was about enduring every calculated threat in silence. The morning fog over San Francisco Bay had lifted, revealing the jagged cliffs and icy waters that surrounded the island. Inside Alcatraz, the echo of steel doors and clanging keys marked the beginning of another day in the tightly regimented prison. Historical records from the National Archives describe the regimented schedules: wake-up calls, roll call, breakfast, work details, and controlled movement through the narrow corridors. Yet, beneath this strict order, tension simmered, a constant, invisible pressure that could snap at any moment. The dining hall, small by modern standards, had become a stage for subtle power struggles. Verified accounts indicate that even a small slice of bread or a slightly fuller tray could become a tool for influence among inmates. Men with histories of violent crimes or organized gang affiliations used these moments to assert dominance. One documented incident involved a dispute over tray allocation that escalated into a fistfight before guards intervened. Reports confirm that such altercations, though rare, were serious enough to prompt immediate disciplinary action, including solitary confinement or temporary reduction in rations. Alcatraz housed some of the nation's most notorious inmates, and their reputations often shaped interactions. Composite accounts derived from inmate memoirs suggest that men with high-profile criminal backgrounds, including organized crime figures or escapees from other facilities, leveraged their notoriety to gain respect or intimidate others. These reputations were not idle; they directly influenced alliances, decisions in the yard, and the outcomes of disputes. Guards recognized this dynamic and often relied on observation and routine checks to maintain order, but the balance of power was constantly negotiated in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Work details were both a necessity and a potential advantage. Men assigned to the kitchen, laundry, or maintenance had access to information and minor privileges. National Archives reports indicate that observant inmates would note guard rotations, meal schedules, and security vulnerabilities, using this knowledge to their benefit without overtly violating rules. A composite pseudonymous account describes a prisoner quietly signaling to a trusted ally during meal service, alerting him to which guard would pass next, a small but crucial advantage in maintaining personal safety and influence. The exercise yard, tightly monitored yet expansive enough for movement, offered a rare opportunity for inmates to display physical presence or assert dominance. Oral histories describe subtle cues: who walked where, who lingered near exits, and how gazes met in fleeting seconds. Even casual gestures could communicate warnings, alliances, or challenges. According to reports, minor miscalculations in these interactions could result in shoving, verbal threats, or minor scuffles, all of which could escalate if not immediately diffused by guard. By midday, the psychological pressure of life on the rock intensified. Men spent long hours confined to their cells, with little sensory stimulation aside from the occasional clanging door or shouted order. Verified accounts confirm that inmates relied heavily on observation, memory, and social intelligence to anticipate potential conflicts or opportunities. Meals, exercise, and work details were not merely routines, they were tests of awareness and adaptability. Even the smallest oversight, a misread glance, a delayed response, or a misplaced word, could shift the balance of power. Historical records from the 1940s and 1950s describe rare but significant episodes of violence. One confirmed event involved a heated confrontation in the dining hall, where an argument over a tray of food led to multiple inmates being restrained and placed in solitary confinement. While fatalities were uncommon inside Alcatraz, the threat of injury, intimidation, and isolation was ever present. These incidents reinforced the lessons recorded in oral histories. Survival required a combination of discretion, observation, and strategic decision-making. Even within the ostensibly rigid hierarchy, alliances formed and dissolved with astonishing speed. Composite accounts suggest that some inmates cultivated relationships not only for immediate protection but also for long-term influence, ensuring they had allies in different cell blocks and work details. The combination of meal control, social observation, and calculated risk-taking created an environment where psychological dominance was often more critical than physical strength. As the day wore on, Alcatraz's shadows grew longer. The echoing footsteps of guards, the metallic rattle of keys, and the low murmur of prisoners created a persistent hum of tension. Meals had been consumed, routines followed, and yet the undercurrent of anxiety persisted. Inmates moved with measured care, aware that a single misstep could result in isolation, punishment, or confrontation. According to verified reports, the most successful men on the rock were those who mastered observation, patience, and subtle influence, navigating a world where every glance and every gesture carried meaning. By evening, the last trays were collected, and the corridors emptied into a heavy silence. In the cells, men reflected on the day, analyzing interactions, recalling subtle signals, and preparing for the next round of psychological tests. Even with rigid routines and strict discipline, Alcatraz remained a place where power, survival, and strategy were constantly in play. And as night fell over the island, the chilling truth remained. On the rock, the deadliest threat often came not from the guards or the walls, but from the men who had learned to survive by understanding every subtle nuance of life behind bars. Clashing forces. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe, because inside Alcatraz, every step, every glance, and every decision could be a fight for survival. The morning fog had barely lifted off the jagged cliffs of Alcatraz Island, yet inside, tension had already taken hold. Steel doors clanged open with mechanical precision, and the echo of guards' boots marked the start of another day in the federal penitentiary. Historical reports confirm that routines were unyielding: roll call, breakfast, work details, and controlled movement through the corridors. Yet beneath this rigid structure, an intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and silent intimidation defined the social ecosystem of the rock. By mid-morning, the dining hall once again became the focal point for subtle battles of power. Verified accounts indicate that even minor items, such as a slightly larger portion of meat or a slice of bread, were leveraged to reinforce authority or curry favor. Composite narratives drawn from memoirs and oral histories suggest that certain notorious inmates monitored these exchanges, silently noting who held influence, who was vulnerable, and who might be persuaded into a temporary alliance. In Alcatraz, meals were not merely sustenance, they were instruments of survival and silent diplomacy. The exercise yards, though heavily supervised, were rife with tension. According to National Archives reports, subtle confrontations frequently erupted over perceived slights, territory, or minor privileges. One documented incident involved a prisoner attempting to assert dominance by approaching a rival during yard time. Guards intervened swiftly, yet the psychological impact of such confrontations lingered long after the physical altercation had ended. These moments underscored the constant pressure inmates faced to navigate the island's unspoken rules. Meals of survival. Before we continue, hit subscribe, because on the Rock, even a simple meal could be a matter of strategy, power, and survival. The early morning fog crept over the jagged cliffs of Alcatraz, curling around the prison's concrete walls like a silent warning. Inside, the dining hall was already alive with measured movement, the clatter of metal trays and the muted footsteps of guards marking the rhythm of the morning. According to verified historical records from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons and National Archives, every meal was strictly scheduled, and deviations were rare. Yet within this rigid system, inmates had found ways to navigate subtle hierarchies, asserting influence through observation, patience, and occasionally daring maneuvers. Meals were more than sustenance. Archival accounts indicate that trays often consisted of watery soups, tough meat, and cold vegetables, reflecting both the prison's strict military-style regimen and the challenges of maintaining quality food on a remote island. Oral histories reveal that inmates quickly learned which portions could be leveraged. A slightly larger slice of bread or a bowl of stew could become a bargaining chip, traded for information, minor favors, or even protection. One pseudonymous composite account recalls how a man nicknamed Red watched the distribution closely, noting who received slightly better portions and subtly adjusting his interactions with others to secure his safety. Punishments related to meals were another facet of Alcatraz's control. According to National Archives reports, minor infractions, a delay in returning trays, failure to stand correctly, or speaking out of turn, could result in reduced rations or solitary confinement. These disciplinary measures were both psychological and physical, reinforcing the prison's strict hierarchy. An unconfirmed oral history suggests that some inmates learned to time their actions and words meticulously, ensuring compliance while protecting their own influence. The most adept prisoners understood that meals were not simply about nutrition but about reading the room, calculating risks, and maintaining alliances. The kitchen itself was a critical arena. Work assignments here provided a rare glimpse into the inner workings of the prison and limited access to resources. Verified accounts indicate that inmates on kitchen duty observed guard routines, distribution patterns, and even potential weaknesses in supervision. Some used this knowledge to maneuver discreetly, ensuring they or their allies received slightly better treatment. Meals became a silent battlefield, a reflection of who controlled information, who held sway over others, and who remained vulnerable. Historical reconstructions also highlight unusual routines and rules surrounding food. For instance, trays were delivered in strict order, and guards closely monitored interactions during meals. Oral histories note that even eye contact or body positioning could indicate submission, defiance, or alliances. Inmates with violent or criminal notoriety often used these subtle cues to maintain dominance without drawing overt attention, a strategy that prevented direct punishment while reinforcing social control. Exercise yards and meal times were linked in unexpected ways. Reports suggest that the behavior exhibited during meals could determine access to yard privileges or work details. A composite account recounts that those perceived as compliant or strategically shrewd might receive small allowances, extra minutes in the yard, minor tasks with less oversight, or the ability to form protective alliances. Conversely, those deemed careless or defiant faced immediate consequences, often communicated quietly through solitary confinement or reduced rations. By mid-afternoon, the psychological weight of these routines had taken hold. Inmates navigated not only the rigid schedules imposed by the guards but also the invisible networks of power established by their peers. Verified memoirs emphasize that the men who thrived were those who could observe patterns, anticipate reactions, and manipulate subtle interactions, all while enduring the harsh conditions of the prison's meals and confinement. Even a seemingly minor decision, whether to eat quickly, linger, or trade portions, carried consequences that could ripple across the day. As evening approached, the fog returned over San Francisco Bay, draping the island in muted gray once more. The dining hall emptied, trays were collected, and prisoners retreated to their cells, where the day's observations, alliances, and rivalries were quietly analyzed. According to documented reports, the most dangerous and experienced inmates understood that each meal, each interaction, and each glance could have life-altering significance. In Alcatraz, survival was not simply about strength or obedience, it was about mastering subtle social dynamics, maintaining psychological control, and navigating the invisible rules of life behind bars. By nightfall, the island fell into a heavy silence, punctuated only by the distant crash of waves and the occasional clang of steel doors. The prisoners reflected on the day, strategizing for the next. In this isolated fortress, the deadliest men had learned a crucial truth. To survive on the rock, one had to endure not only the cold walls and harsh routines but the complex, invisible social game that played out with every meal, every look, and every subtle gesture. The edge of escape. Before we continue, hit subscribe, because on Alcatraz, every step, every decision, and every miscalculated move could be the difference between survival and disaster. The fog over San Francisco Bay hung heavy that morning, seeping into every corner of the prison. Inside Alcatraz, the routine rhythm of clanging doors, rattling keys, and echoing footsteps masked an undercurrent of constant tension. According to historical reports and verified National Archives documents, life on the rock was a delicate balance of strict discipline, calculated observation, and psychological endurance. Inmates moved cautiously, aware that any deviation, intentional or accidental, could provoke punishment, isolation, or violent conflict. Escape attempts were a rare but ever-present threat. The 1962 disappearance of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers is one of the most documented cases in Alcatraz history. Verified accounts detail their meticulous planning, use of makeshift tools, and understanding of guard routines. Though their ultimate fate remains officially unconfirmed, this event created a heightened atmosphere of vigilance among both guards and prisoners. Reports suggest that in the days following, guards intensified patrols, while inmates quietly speculated on the possibilities and risks of attempting their own escape. Even minor breaches in routine carried risk. According to archival records, one inmate attempted to conceal contraband in the laundry room, only to be caught during a routine inspection. Solitary confinement and reduced rations followed swiftly, illustrating the unforgiving discipline system. Oral histories emphasize that these events were not isolated. The combination of strict oversight, psychological pressure, and interpersonal dynamics made Alcatraz a prison where miscalculations could have immediate and severe consequences. The exercise yards, while seemingly open, were heavily controlled environments. Historical reconstructions indicate that inmates who attempted to test boundaries, whether through subtle provocation or deliberate rule-breaking, were closely monitored. One pseudonymous composite account describes an inmate observing guards' patrol schedules, calculating opportunities for minor advantage, such as positioning oneself strategically in the yard to avoid confrontation or gain a slight tactical edge. These actions, while mundane to the casual observer, were critical survival tactics for the most experienced prisoners. Meals continued to reflect the prison's complex social structure. Verified reports describe how distribution was strictly regulated, yet some inmates subtly influenced allocation through minor intimidation or alliances. Oral histories detail how the most strategic prisoners leveraged these moments to communicate, negotiate, or reinforce social hierarchies. Even something as seemingly simple as choosing where to sit during meals could convey messages of alliance or dominance. Every action was layered with intent, observation, and consequence. Throughout the day, tensions escalated. Documented accounts confirm that altercations occasionally erupted during meal distribution or yard time, prompting guard intervention. One confirmed incident involved a dispute over territory in a work detail, which required immediate disciplinary action. While fatalities were rare, the threat of injury, intimidation, or isolation was ever present. This constant tension reinforced the lessons recorded in inmate memoirs. Survival depended on mental acuity, observation, and the ability to navigate social hierarchies invisibly. Even at night, the psychological pressures remained. According to National Archives reports, solitary confinement, restricted meals, and limited movement were used strategically to maintain order, particularly following high-stakes events like escape attempts. Inmates had to remain vigilant, assessing potential threats from peers, anticipating guard behavior, and strategizing for the next day. The most adept prisoners understood that success on the rock required continuous attention, patience, and subtle manipulation, a mental endurance test as grueling as any physical challenge. The days following documented escape attempts were particularly tense. Guards increased patrols, inspected routines, and monitored inmate interactions closely. Oral histories suggest that prisoners responded in kind, adjusting behavior, testing alliances, and observing weaknesses in others. These documented dynamics created an environment where even ordinary routines, like attending meals or participating in work details, became exercises in strategy and survival. As the sun began to set, the fog returned to the bay, draping the island in gray. Inside, Alcatraz's cell blocks fell into silence punctuated only by the distant clang of doors and muted footsteps. The prisoners reflected on the day, recalculating alliances, analyzing minor confrontations, and preparing for the next day's challenges. The rock had already tested its inhabitants for decades, and it would continue to do so, demanding constant vigilance and strategic thinking. In Alcatraz, every plan, every glance, and every subtle move could tip the balance between control and chaos. The last day on the rock, before we conclude, hit subscribe, because the final truth about life on Alcatraz is as chilling as it is instructive. Surviving the rock was never about freedom, it was about mastering every nuance of its walls. The fog clung to San Francisco Bay once more, rolling across the jagged cliffs like a silent observer. Inside Alcatraz, the morning bell echoed across the cell blocks, signaling another day of strict routines. Verified reports from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons confirm that schedules were rigid: roll call, breakfast, work details, yard time, and evening lockup. Yet beneath the regimented exterior, the daily struggles of survival continued. Men who had endured years on the rock knew that each action, a glance, a step, or a gesture, could alter their day, their standing, or even their safety. Meals remained a crucible of social dynamics and strategic behavior. Archival records and oral histories describe the stark reality. Watery soups, tough meat, and stale bread were the norm, reflecting the island's strict military-style control. Composite pseudonymous accounts reveal that inmates leveraged even minor portions to cement alliances, secure protection, or gain influence. One former inmate noted that a simple slice of bread could signal loyalty, gratitude, or leverage, and understanding these unspoken codes was essential for surviving both physical and psychological challenges. Every meal carried stakes far beyond nutrition. Work details continued to be both an opportunity and a test. Historical records confirm that inmates assigned to the kitchen, laundry, or maintenance gained limited access and observation power. This allowed strategic prisoners to monitor routines, track guard behavior, and communicate covertly with allies. Reports indicate that some men subtly influenced who received small privileges or minor resources, maintaining social dominance without drawing punitive attention. These micro-strategies were crucial in navigating Alcatraz's invisible hierarchy, demonstrating that intelligence and observation were as vital as physical strength. The exercise yard offered moments of controlled freedom, yet it was also a stage for tension and subtle maneuvering. Verified incidents document how rivalries could erupt over perceived slights, territorial claims, or minor provocations. Even without overt violence, body language, positioning, and fleeting glances communicated power, intent, and alliances. Oral histories emphasize that survival often depended on reading these cues accurately and responding with calculated restraint. A single misinterpretation could trigger punishment, isolation, or conflict. As the day progressed, historical events remind us that life on the Rock was filled with rare but impactful crises. From documented escape attempts to internal altercations, the prison remained a theater of vigilance and control. One confirmed incident involved a dispute over tray distribution escalating into a brief, physical confrontation before guards intervened. These events, while contained, reinforced the constant need for strategic thinking and psychological acuity among the most dangerous inmate. Evenings brought reflective tension. Inmates returned to their cells, processing interactions, recalculating alliances, and anticipating the next day's challenges. Verified accounts and memoirs emphasize the mental toll of prolonged confinement and constant observation. The isolation, combined with relentless discipline, created an environment where survival was equal parts psychological endurance and tactical awareness. Those who mastered these skills navigated the Rock more safely, while those who faltered risked punishment, conflict, or solitary confinement. The cumulative effect of years on Alcatraz shaped the men within its walls. National Archives and Bureau of Prisons records suggest that survival required continuous attention, measured behavior, and careful alliances. Even the most notorious inmates, men with histories of violence, escape attempts, or organized crime, relied on subtle influence, observation, and patience rather than brute force alone. The Rock demanded intelligence, discretion, and unwavering awareness to endure its unforgiving regimen. By nightfall, the prison settled into silence. Steel doors clanged shut, the fog rolled back over the bay, and the jagged cliffs glimmered under moonlight. Inmates lay in their cells, contemplating alliances, past conflicts, and the invisible rules of survival that had governed their days. According to verified reports, the Rock's most dangerous men had learned to navigate these rules with precision, balancing observation, subtlety, and psychological mastery. In the end, survival on Alcatraz was less about physical escape and more about enduring, adapting, and outthinking both the prison and fellow inmate. The Rock had claimed many reputations, shattered many psyches, and tested every aspect of human endurance. Meals, routines, and interactions all became part of a complex social and psychological ecosystem. For those who survived, the lessons were enduring. Vigilance, strategic thinking, and subtle influence were more powerful than brute strength, and even the deadliest men on Alcatraz had to respect the invisible rules that governed life behind bars. As the fog thickened once more over San Francisco Bay, the story of the Rock remained a testament to the extreme conditions, strategic survival, and psychological battles faced by America's most notorious inmate. Alcatraz was not merely a prison, it was a laboratory of human endurance, discipline, and the subtle, deadly art of survival under constant observation.